Very happy to continue the marathon and to welcome Sophie Fiennes. First question I wanted to ask you has to do a little bit with a question I had been asking Zaha Hadid earlier tonight. When I asked Zaha about London and her still unrealized projects related to London, when she said London is for her still an unrealized project. You're working on London right now, and you say that it's also a yet unrealized project on its way. So I was curious to know more.
Yeah, well, it is. It's actually a fictional project, because most of the work that I've done, well, all the work that I've done so far has been documentary, because I really enjoy a certain chaotic way of working in documentary. You never know what you're going to get, and you have to be in a very responsive relationship to material. So I've been developing something based on some areas of London that intrigue me near where I live. And one of them is this waste disposal site on the river, where there are big barges that take all the waste out of London, 600 tons every day on these barges. And it's the relationship between this work, this mechanism of emptying the city of its waste. And then also nearby there's this is a very Victorian, old English Victorian feeling to this site. The barges, it almost seems like 19th century. And then there's another area around, very nearby, Nine Elms, which is where I live in Stockwell.
Where is this?
Nine Elms, Stockwell. It's where they shot the Brazilian, the poor Brazilian guy. Mm-hmm. So it's a ghost story that I'm setting in two locations, one which is this waste disposal area and the other one which is this mail postal sorting office.
And is it a feature film, a full-length film?
Yes, I intend it to be that, yeah.
It's kind of really interesting because you're not there the whole time, but we hear certain things and certain words that are repeated. You're the fifth person who uses the word ghosts.
Really?
Yes. So, what made you do a ghost story?
Well, actually, it's a ghost story. It's set amongst two different times, and it's a kind of a ghost story, but it's a pre-life story. So it's the haunting of something that hasn't come into being, not of the dead that have passed. It's a kind of haunting from the future rather than the past.
And it's not the first time you work on London, so I was somehow wondering if you could talk a little bit about this. I mean, this sort of impossibility of making a portrait of a city is something I'm very interested in. I mean, Stefano Boeri always said that the idea of making a synthetic image of a city is a priori impossible, and mainly of a city like London being so complex. So I wanted to ask you if you could talk a little bit about this idea of a portrait of a city and how you work.
Yeah, I made a choral portrait of a city with, which was an Art Angel project in collaboration with Alain Platel, who's a Belgian choreographer, theatre maker. And it was something that they invited me to do because they had got together choirs. So it was a way to make a portrait through a very particular one thematic basis, which was these amateur choirs. And sometimes I find it's best to make a very tight frame to go further into ideas. And so this portrait was, in a sense, very contained.
Can you tell us more about it? Was it?
Well, there were many different choirs. There was a gay men's choir, there was a WI, Women's Institute choir, and they all seemed to represent different communities that made up a sense of a portrait. But of course, when you do documentary, observational documentary, it becomes quite paralyzing because there's such a contingent, ongoing expansiveness of people that you find it very touching when you just really go close into very intimate situations. So instead of being about scale, in a sense it becomes more about trying to find individuality or moments, documentary moments within the vastness of a city like London.
How do you feel has London changed since you live here and work here? How do you see the change of the city?
It's changed in its texture in a big way, which is, well, because when I was about 21, I worked on a film called The Cook, the Thief, His Wife and Her Lover. I worked with Peter Greenaway. And I was the art department production manager of this film, and it was in the late 80s, and I had to go around and salvage lots of objects from various places, from old factories. They were closing down, Mrs. Thatcher was closing down all the hospitals. So we went to the Moorfields Eye Hospital and we extracted all these old cookers, and I took lights, and the Isle of Dogs then was completely Victorian. There was this red brick, kind of heavy, gothic, spectral. It does have this ghostly quality that Victorian London, which you see disappearing, and it's replaced by this kind of light industrial, neon strip lit, disposable architecture that you feel is there for a very brief time. It's not there to last. So in that sense, I feel that the Victorian London is kind of disappearing, really. Even if warehouses get turned into loft apartments, the kind of sense of it has changed.
Ren, do you have questions, or shall I continue?
I have almost a question. So maybe you go first.
So maybe I continue,
Okay.
and then actually, one of the things I was wondering is that as we are here recording infinite conversations,
Yeah.
and I was mentioning that, I mean, one of the triggers of doing this whole interview project have been these very, very long conversations David Sylvester has had with Francis Bacon. And obviously, doing documentaries on one person means also having very long, infinite conversations. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about those sort of conversations. I think you're doing a film right now on Grace Jones. And
Yes, well, no, I was interested to be on the receiving end of a conversation or an interview, because I very rarely embark on interviews, because I'm usually trying to, I kind of enjoy myself as a presence behind a camera. I think I even hide behind a camera, really. And so I have conversations to get something, feeling that I'm, to balance the situation, to balance the dynamics of it. But I very rarely actually do interviews, because I think they're very hard to do. But I just feel more excited by being a sort of free-floating eye that sees in a certain way, and framing things in one way or another changes them very emphatically.
yeah, and can you tell us a little bit about previous such documentaries you've made on specific people?
Well, what was interesting, actually, in talking about Portraits of a City, was that the film that I made was called Hoover Street Revival. It was really a portrait of Los Angeles through this Pentecostal church. And it was really a portrait of that community, but it was through the relationship of the sermons that were preached and the response of the parishioners, and the tension between this very idealistic, ecstatic, kind of Holy Ghost-filled life in church, and then this incredibly flat life outside. And I'm interested in where there are places where there's an attempt for some kind of ecstatic experience. That was interesting to me. As the singing portrait was the same thing.
Is this kind of a road movie, the Hoover Street Revival, one can say, or
A what?
is it a road movie?
No, it was very anchored around this fixed point of the church, and then it was portraits. It was little moments with the people in the community who were affected by the sermons of the bishop. So
I want to ask you about the classical division between documentary and feature film, and one is supposed to be authentic and the other one is supposed to be artificial and manipulated. And I also see that you have worked with Lars von Trier and Dogma, and Dogma seems to be taking a kind of interesting in-between position of wanting to be authentic fiction. So that's a kind of almost a triangle. How do you see that as?
Well, I mean, this is a question that I'm always enjoying, because actually I don't consider myself a proper documentary filmmaker, because I'm not a journalist, and I'm much more interested in the kind of material that you create, and then creating juxtapositions, and in fact fictionalizing reality, playing with the grammar of cinema that constructs a three-dimensional space in the mind of the viewer, and imposing that kind of grammar onto reality was the premise of Hoover Street Revival, because it was a way to try to sort of see the fiction in reality itself, or the sense that a cinematic feeling was as close to reality as a supposed interview.
I completely understand. And how do you see in that context what Dogma was doing or is doing, and how do you kind of interpret their following?
Well, I think Dogma was really about recognizing that when you make any piece of work, you have a set of rules, and he just made them explicit, and then he broke them a lot of the time, and it was about pushing himself out of the unspoken rules that he had already. It was a way of pushing himself beyond a certain aesthetic that he didn't want to repeat. That was how I saw it.
And do you still follow him, or?
Yeah, I thought Dogville was fantastic. I loved the fact that it was just on a black space, a black stage, and it was everything, all reality had been stripped away, and yet when you watched it, you had a very strong sense of this community that it was portraying.
Do you think there's something like that? Because there is in architecture there is a certain kind of analogous movement. What would be the analogous movement in art? Do you have any idea?
To Dogma?
Yeah.
What is it in architecture?
Well, I think that maybe some of its representatives will be here later. They even talk about it, Koolhaas and John. Yeah.
No, I don't see it as a movement in contemporary art.
You mean creating rules?
Well, so that the issue of rules becomes kind of so explicit and becomes almost a movement in itself at some point.
But I think with exhibitions is always about rules of the game in some kind of way, and I think that's sort of definitely something we'll hear from Richard Hamilton hopefully later tomorrow. I mean, this whole idea, if an exhibition doesn't invent a new rule of the game, which very often is a display feature, is initially already doomed to oblivion anyhow, so it's something which is maybe more sort of almost normal.
They have a different question. Almost all the people we talked to were adamant that in London there are no boundaries between professions, and that therefore there was a kind of unusual cross-contamination between them. Is that true for film as well in London, or?
No, I think film, unlike the art world, is a very enclosed, and in England it always wants to be closer to commerce, and there's a lack of confidence to do something that's taking more risks. And I feel like, I mean, every time I make a film, I take the attitude that I don't care if they never commission another film from me again, because it's the only way that I can then work to sort of my own rules. I mean, I don't know whether I'm really answering your question, but I think it's quite a, from my experience of looking at British film, it's not that alive. I mean, I look for inspiration from other areas, and in that sense there is a kind of, for me, a crossing over into looking at how other people work, and I enjoy that connection with other people, like Michael Clarke, who was here before, who I worked with. I enjoy sensing how he thought, being a choreographer, being a dancer, that it seemed to generate a very different way of thinking.
You mentioned inspiration, and I'm very curious to know more about your inspirations and what somehow inspires you, particularly also in terms of the past. If there are any kind of filmmakers or other practitioners from the past who for you are a toolbox for your kind of present activity.
There's people who I've enjoyed in the past, and they've been very formative for me, and they are European filmmakers basically from the 60s and 70s.
So would Jean Rouch be someone who somehow matters for you?
Well, I mean, I'm not really in that sense. My background isn't documentary; it's much more fiction, and I found myself making documentary because of these small cameras that enable you to make films. Because the mechanics of trying to get funding, the kind of a year spent having lunches with people, or I don't know what. This is why I mean about the anxiety for me of trying to make fiction, is that I'm scared that I'm going to lose the freedom, the creative freedom that I have in shooting digital video and making films, forming them, editing them myself on Apple Macs. The last project that I did on cinema with Slavoj Žižek, I cut it myself at home in my one-bedroom flat.
Can you tell us about this Žižek film?
Yeah, it's called The Pervert's Guide to Cinema. And it was originally commissioned as a 48-minute film for Channel 4. But when I got the material and I looked at it, I realized that it had to be a bigger in length. So I ended up making a 3-part film with 3 50-minute pieces. And I found it fascinating to look at fiction from his perspective, because it was exactly the kind of imaginative way of responding to images and about form, really, about ultimately beyond narrative, because in fiction there's always this, now particularly in funding bodies, it's an obsession about a script, an obsession about a plot. And when you see cinema through Slavoy's method of looking at it, it's in fact what he calls the libidinal density of forms in cinema. This is where the real enjoyment is. And that was the kind of, that was, as he would say, the transcendental agenda of the project.
Many thanks, Sophie Fiennes. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you.